Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Inntopia's Glancing Back and Looking Ahead webinar for February of 2024. This is a session we've done several times before. It's always well attended and well received. It's great to have Barb as our moderator. She does an excellent job and brings good information to the conversation and keeps Pete and Jan and myself in line. We'll do a few intros in just a second. Just a reminder, the session is being recorded and we are going to share it out afterwards. And if you've got questions, we do have an active retro board. There's a link to that board in the chat window. If you want to go there, you can add questions. You can vote on questions that currently exist in there. There's some pretty interesting ones. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator, Barb, and we'll kick off.
And I am going to be equally respectful of time and give a just very short overview of who's going to do what to who and why. So we're going to start out with Jan, who's going to give us the big picture on the industry, followed by Pete, who is the traveler side of the equation, and then Tom, who focuses on the travel industry performance in mountain destinations. We'll do self-introductions, which is always pretty fun, and I'm going to start with Pete, Tom, and Jan, and he will then go right into the session because we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to participate as much as you are able to and or ask the questions that we might not be drilling down in enough or that we haven't even touched on. So Pete, over to you.
Thank you, Barb. So Pete Comeau here. I am the Managing Director of Focusrite. And for all of you that don't know, Focusrite is a travel industry research firm focused on the intersection of travel and digital. So we look at technology trends. We also produce conferences. And lastly, we cover the daily ongoing news focused around acquisitions, investment, startups in the travel category. So great to see many familiar faces on this webinar. Tom, I'll hand it to you to introduce yourself.
I am Tom Foley, the SVP of Business Intelligence at Inntopia. And for those who aren't familiar with Inntopia, we are a travel technology and research company. We do e-commerce, we do marketing, and we do actual research based on that data and data we collect independently from partner properties. Been around in the industry for 20 odd years and looking forward to the balance of this session. And a man who needs no introduction, but we'll introduce him, Jan Freitag. Jan.
That is so kind. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm Jan Freitag, National Director for Hospitality Analytics at CoStar. CoStar is a premium provider of CRE data, so office, industrial, retail. I'm the hotel guy. We're also the owner of Homes.com, and you will hear a lot more about them this coming Sunday afternoon. I have been 20 years prior to CoStar with STR. CoStar bought STR, so I will talk a little bit about the STR forecast in my comments. Thanks for having me.
And we're going to have you jump right into that, Jan.
Let's do that. So if you bring up the first slide, this is our view of the world for the United States lodging industry. This is the RevPAR forecast for this year, as was presented by the president of STR, Amanda Hyde, at the ALIS conference, which is sort of the largest hotel investment conference in the US and sort of kicks off the year. It happened 2 weeks ago in LA. Point here is 3 things. Number 1, RevPAR change is positive, 4 handle, driven by room rate growth in the 3 range or so, which is above the level of inflation, which is good. And you see here, and the delta is the occupancy increase. So we're proposing an continued occupancy increase. Why? Because the American economy is expanding and supply growth is really not a headwind. Supply last year grew 0.9%. This year it's going to have a 1 handle, but not a whole lot. So new supply, not a big deal. Room demand is going to grow. That gives us some occupancy expansion, and then we're going to see ADR growth. And you see that sort of pattern continue for the remainder of the forecast horizon. However, inflation, CPI, Consumer Price Index increases have been so steep since 2019 that we are not forecasting real RevPAR growth until, well, really 2027. That's not even in our forecast horizon. So yes, this year we're going to see an outpacing of inflation, but overall, back to 2019, we haven't seen any real pricing power. So that's how we look at the world right now. And we'll obviously go more into it during the Q&A. And then if you want to look, go to the next slide. This is just one data point that makes us really, really arguably bullish on a subpart of the industry, which is group. What you're seeing here is the total number of group rooms sold last year by month, and then compared to the same month in 2019. And I had to go to the second digit after the comma, but in October of 2023, we sold more group rooms than in October of 2019. And I think if you fast forward to this spring and then also this fall, you will likely see months where we're going to continue to outpace 2019 results. And I think that bodes well for downtown properties. I think that bodes well for resort destinations that have incentive groups. And I think it bodes well really for hotels that have ballroom space, or what we call upper upscale type hotels. And hopefully then with that comes some pricing power. So those are my remarks. Are we going to jump into Q&A right now? Do you want, Tom, do you want to talk about, add a little bit to this?
Well, you had talked about fall being the time. What's the particular reason for fall being the time that you're looking at group, continuing to accelerate beyond 2019?
Just the convention calendar normally, heats up after people come back from vacation in August, and then early September, after Labor Day, you see this rapid ramp up in citywide conventions, in meetings, in association trade show events. And we're going to continue to see that in September, October, maybe right before Thanksgiving into November. The other piece, so I was in Denver yesterday, actually, at a hotel management team conference, and I was asking them about their outlook for groups, and they said it's really hard to budget because the booking windows for some of those groups has been really crushed. So we're no longer talking in the quarter, for the quarter meetings, but literally this one sales lady told me that they had a 200-room peak night event come to them 2 weeks before the event. So it's like in the month, for the month. Impossible to forecast. But what that means then to me is that there's more upside than downside on the group. There's just people are making very, very short booking term decisions, but the groups are going to continue to flow.
That's really interesting. Thanks for answering that.
Sure, and I'll hand it over to Pete.
Great. So Jan, thanks for sharing your words about group business. I think our conference kind of follows the same trend, that it's been not only recovering quite well, but also the booking windows are indeed short. So it makes it really, really challenging to forecast. But we're certainly seeing a lot of the same trends on the groups and meetings side of the industry. I wanted to start by glancing back. So last year I introduced a project that we were undertaking focused on a traveler survey that we fielded in 6 markets to understand traveler beliefs around sustainable travel and how their actual behavior mapped against their beliefs. We also, as part of this effort, conducted a series of 20 interviews with destinations, suppliers, intermediaries who sell travel to provide some qualitative insights into the progress that's being made and also the obstacles that the industry is facing around sustainable travel. And, sustainability itself may be a hot topic, button around the travel industry, but acknowledgement and understanding of the issue by the industry does not always translate to awareness or concern from travelers. And travelers, what we found, they certainly have good intentions, but a lack of understanding of how to travel sustainably, and sustainability considerations rarely impact their trip decisions. So we asked travelers in 6 key markets first about their behavior on their past trip, and then about their attitudes around sustainability. And the reason why we did that was to remove the survey bias when they're actually reporting on behavior. So we asked them to report on behavior first, and then we cued them into the survey, purpose around sustainability. And in general, travelers believe that they prioritize sustainability far more than they do when it actually comes to making decisions about their trips. And there's this gap between the way they see themselves, the good intentions they have, and the choices that they actually make. And the gap may be forged both by issues on the supplier side. For example, the lack of understanding of what options are out there from a sustainability perspective, the lack of clarity or labeling, as well as on the consumer side, them not researching, checking, or really seeking those options out. So from the data perspective, around half of travelers say that they're more likely to book lodging based on environmental considerations than they are to book it for convenience or price. Their actual choices, however, tell a very different story. Only 6 to 13% said that green practices were a factor when choosing between comparable accommodation options. Those sustainability-minded travelers don't place heavy priority on green options when they book, it's really important to understand that they're much more likely to avoid options across categories that are not perceived as being more sustainable. So travelers are actually ruling out those options that are not sustainable, especially with tours and activities, as you can see on the bottom of this chart. So really important to kind of consider as a resort destination, how do you position yourself or confront this trend? Labeling, it can be as simple as labeling. That's a great place to start. There's also an opportunity to help consumers understand what to research and what they should look into before trips, but really good choices need to truly be absolutely in their faces. And furthermore, people want to learn about sustainability earlier in the process than later when possible. So ultimately, knowledge of travelers' awareness of the issue, motivations to travel sustainably, traveler behaviors, and how much responsibility they are willing to take for the health of the destinations they visit is crucial for the industry as it aims to involve more travelers in making more sustainable travel choices.
Pete, it's making my head blow up a little bit. So I won't put the camera on for that part. But I'm curious on this, however, because we know that experiential rates high, or so people say, which as your data shows, might not be driving decisions. Who should be driving this conversation? The traveler or the destination? And in that, I mean, for example, you named labeling as a good place to start. Are you seeing best practices anywhere that is having an impact on travelers choosing a specific destination over another when it comes to sustainability? And Jan and Tom, jump in, please.
Yeah, so Barb, this was a lot of nuts and bolts, and I think the basics is truly about positioning and awareness. Travelers are willing to make decisions earlier on in the process if they perceive a comparable destination offers more sustainability. They're maybe more inclined to make that choice. At the end of the day, once they've chosen their destination, as it gets down to where the rubber hits the road, they're going to make the choice based on price, convenience, location. Those are the factors that, as we've surveyed travelers for decades, those are the things that are always at the top of the list. So, certainly the industry can really impact just by being a little bit more obtuse about about labeling certain things, certain aspects of their hotel or destination that really caters towards a more sustainable traveler. Education is definitely part of the process. I think we've seen across mainstream media there's a lot more discussion around sustainability. We're just not seeing it really play a huge impact on how they're making decisions about specific travel products.
Okay, thank you.
I've got two thoughts on this, and one of them is related to the chart in front of us, which tells me that it's very easy to lose out on sustainably conscious consumers because they are actively shunning those choices that aren't promoting themselves or otherwise. But the other side of the coin is, based on the behavior piece of this slide, it's very, very difficult to actively capture them as well. And so good intentions, only go so far, and it sounds like you'd have to do more than just shout from the rooftops to actually capture them. But inaction can put you on the losing end of the spectrum really easily. It's a tough one.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So let's shift a little bit, Tom, from sustainability.
Can just add one quick comment?
Yeah, sure, Jan.
I am continually underwhelmed by the amount of conversations at the hotel investment conferences in the United States about sustainability or even climate change. There are panels on how high insurance costs are rising, but there's not a whole lot of conversation about climate change and mitigation. My sense is from our European friends that conversation is much, much more forward in Europe, and that the sustainability angle from an ownership perspective is a lot more front and center of the thinking than it is here in the US.
Interesting, and I'm not sure I'm surprised by that. I don't think I am. Pete, did you want to go on?
Yeah, so let's shift a little bit from sustainability to some broader based traveler behavior trends. So we fielded our US consumer travel report for, almost a couple of decades now. And within this particular study, we track travel attitudes, behavior around their last trip, as well as we look at future travel plans. So we ask them about, how they're thinking about their upcoming travel. Just some key broader findings that are not, captured on this slide. In general, travel continues to top the list of spending priorities among US adults, and this has remained pretty consistent for the past couple of years. So while we may have moved beyond that period of revenge travel, consumers are still truly prioritizing travel experiences over consumables such as TVs and electronics, dining and home improvement. Just over a third of US travelers traveled internationally, with the older traveler generations prioritizing overseas trips and the younger demographics staying a little bit closer to home, visiting the islands, Caribbean islands, or Mexico. Interesting finding that in terms of trip frequency, travelers averaged 3.2 trips per year, which was exactly the same frequency that we saw back in 2019. Also, 6 in 10 conducted some type of business during at least one of their trips, including more than half of them who worked remotely. So I know there was a question on the Trello board about business, and we can maybe capture that in some of our discussion after we get through these slides. From a trip type perspective, urban and beach were tied for the most popular overall when we're talking about past trip. And again, the older demographics prioritize smaller towns over theme parks, which probably isn't overly surprising. If we carry trip type, so now we're getting into the slide itself. If we carry trip type from past trip to future plans, we see some pretty interesting trends develop here. So there's less intention for travelers to go to urban destinations or small towns, and more intention to visit lakes and rivers, mountains, and hiking, as well as all-inclusive. So this is pretty good news for resort destinations, although keep in mind that intentions do not always become reality. And it's important to really think this through, because life confronts all of us, and often unforeseen reasons to visit friends and families in larger areas of populations occur. So maybe as they're dreaming about their trip, they're thinking about lakes and rivers and mountains and hiking, but we will see likely some of that shift when it comes to where they actually travel to.
Pete, I know this is a U.S. survey, but was it U.S. destinations as well? Were they planning to stay domestically?
So this particular data maps out, this is the entire survey panel. So, you know, some of them will certainly travel internationally as a third of them did in the past. Mm-hmm. So that this captures all of that sample.
Yeah.
Is there, and we know that business travel is on the upswing. Is there any data that links the percentage of business travel that then stays on for, we'll call it a leisure stay?
Yes, there is. And we can get into that a little bit, Barb, during the discussion. Of course, blended travel is a term. We used to call it be-leisure or bleisure, and it became blended travel during the pandemic. And I think we're certainly seeing that trend continue where there's a lot of trips that start out as leisure. There's some remote work that happens. You know, we even see that in days of week. You know, the airlines it's becoming a little more difficult for them to manage against business travel because people are traveling Wednesdays for long weekends. They're working Thursday and Friday and then skiing or hiking or doing what they love to do through the weekend. So, but yes, we can talk about some of the specific numbers as we get into the discussion.
I thought the term was mullet travel. Business in the front, party in the back.
Not too, Jan.
I'll get that out of my head for a while.
One more slide for me, Tom. I leaked over my 2-slide limit, but I thought this was really interesting because as it goes with Focusrite, we talk a lot about technology, and another trend that we will certainly follow closely in 2024 is the evolution of AI and more specifically generative AI or Gen AI. So if you haven't heard of ChatGPT, I don't know where you've been living for the past 15 months. Again, I might be a little too close to it because that's what we do, but ChatGPT had enormous hype when it was released into the public in late 2022. The numbers are staggering. You can look them up. Just the amount of usage of this particular technology when OpenAI released it to the public is really unprecedented. And travel companies were really quick to jump on the bandwagon. Expedia, Booking, TripAdvisor, others released their kind of conversational AI-based chat interfaces, experimenting with streamlining trip planning and trying to get to more personalized results. Interestingly enough, we also heard from Trip.com, which is the largest OTA in Asia, that their conversion rates on their ChatGPT planning tool was actually double that of the average user that comes through the Trip.com platform. So clearly astonishing, obviously very early adopters that are using these tools, but to see a conversion rate double in the OTA space when they're just trying to maximize incrementally their conversions is really quite astonishing. So this particular chart gets into traveler behavior, and when we ask travelers about their comfort level using Gen AI to help plan a trip, depending upon the market, if we look at some of these, the 6 key markets, anywhere from roughly a third to a half said that they were somewhat or extremely comfortable using Gen AI platform to help plan a trip. And that's in some ways not overly surprising because Gen AI is designed to be a very simple conversational interface. So it doesn't require you to be a super techie to actually use it. But it's quite a high percentage, truly, considering the newness of the technology. And I think it potentially speaks to how game-changing this tech will be as we move ahead. But I do have one prediction that I've seen a few of these, these kind of tech disruptions that will we're going to impact our industry overnight, and rarely do they impact overnight. It generally takes quite some time for them to prove themselves out. So I think 10 years from now, I suspect that the impact of this technology will probably be more than what we're kind of anticipating that it will be, as we're talking today. So I truly think we might be underestimating the impact now that this technology will have. One more thing that I want to leave you with before I hand it over to Tom. So Bill Gates wrote one of his Gates notes. So I don't know if you don't tune into Bill Gates and his Gates notes, this one is really, I think, particularly relevant to the travel industry. So he wrote a post in November on how AI is about to completely change how you use computers. And travel is one of the top use cases that he identified early on in his post when he compared static bots to AI-trained agents. And I quote, "Imagine that you want to plan a trip. A travel bot will identify hotels that fit your budget. An agent will know what time of year you'll be traveling, and based on its knowledge about whether you always try a new destination or like to return to the same place repeatedly, it will be able to suggest locations. When asked, it will recommend things to do based on your interest, propensity for adventure, and it will book reservations at the type of restaurants that you would enjoy. If you want this kind of deeply personalized planning today, you need to pay a travel agent and spend time telling them what you want." So this concept of agents is something that has the potential to be a really big game changer. And OpenAI is actually, there's some rumors about them really getting into this space where you'll have agents that'll help you do lots of different things for you. And I think this is potentially the biggest impact that Gen AI will have. Not only will you have a travel agent that will be able to learn about your personalization, what you prefer, but they'll actually be able to go to your preferred sites and preferred loyalty programs and all of those things that we struggle as an industry to do. So I'll leave it there. We can get into more discussion around Gen AI technology during the conversation. But Tom, why don't I hand it over to you?
I'll just give you a sample of one. We went to Germany over Christmas and two nights in Amsterdam, and my wife just put in, hey, 6 and an 8-year-old, 2 nights in Amsterdam, top 5 things to do. Within 0.2 seconds, you get an itinerary. We didn't know anything, and it was just really, really, really helpful to start the conversation, to start the search. I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Let's dig further into it. And that, I don't know, online it would have taken us probably the first 15 minutes. So it was super, super helpful.
It is true, Jan. And one thing we see frequently is a lot of startups that are trying to completely cut out the trip planning process. And what actually, and it never works because planning a trip is often the biggest part of the trip. You spend more time planning it, and there's a reason for that, because dreaming about destinations and making sure you got the best deal is a big part of travel. But being able to streamline the process to get you more appropriate and personalized results, I think that is going to be the key. And you made the point that it kind of saves you time to really get to that early phases of discovery, which I think is going to truly be game changing.
That's awesome. By the way, you reminded me how old I am, because I remember conversations with Crater where we were trying to predict how many of your reservations were going to come in online in the late 90s. The answer at one point was 25%, and the response was no. So we're moving forward. And on that note, I will go ahead and move forward as well. So we're going to get this up on the screen. Next up, it's my turn. I'm going to talk about mountain destinations and what's going on with them. A couple of things looking back. At the top of this chart, we've got to look at average daily rate. And really the big story of the past year is over on the right-hand side of the screen. This goes from February of 22 through to January of this year. And it's really looking at year-over-year ADR. And of course, on the far left-hand side, we can see what the recovery from the prior season looked like and the really strong rate gains that we were getting and capturing. and how that sort of died down for quite a while, though. Rate actually underperformed in the middle of 22. It underperformed what was happening with inflation, and it actually looked like a pretty good value and sustainable. Come 23, that flipped, and we really saw the story around ADR gains drop. Consumer pressures, excuse me, were a big part of it. It really came to play once the end of the ski season happened last year in 2023. And as soon as summer started to be the booking window, things settled down into these 2 and 3 and 4 point rate gains. And that's actually really, really healthy, and it's good to see. But it has been the story of the year as ADR settles in. The chart we're looking at here is actually looking at the 3-month moving average, and that helps get rid of some of the noise in there. And off on the right-hand side, we can see that on average over the course of the past 5 months, rate is sitting very close to flat. Compared to where it was last year. And that's part of this consumer reset that we're seeing. Consumers are still playing catch up. We look at inflation rates that are 3.1, 3.2, 3.7%, and those are obviously a lot more palatable than the 8% last year. But we need to be reminded that inflation has a really long tail to it, and consumers are continuing to feel the hit. On the plus side, wages are going up more than inflation now, and they have been for 7 or 8 months. And that starts to reverse itself, and we see really, really strong investment marketplaces where 401ks and IRAs are starting to grow again, and people feel good about what's happening on Wall Street, and that's starting to reflect in consumer confidence. So consumers are feeling better about things. But we're also, as an industry, and when I say we, I'm talking now specifically to mountain resorts and mountain destinations, are a fairly elite industry as far as the price point goes. I can remember years ago when Jan first showed up at Mountain Travel Symposium, and one of the things I think he said in the session was, you guys are complaining about a $380 a night ADR, and we'd love to see that in the hotel industry. And of course, now we've got a $670 ADR in January of 2024 for the winter, which is a dramatic gain. So rate has been a big part of it, and it's been in response to softness in bookings that really sort of showed up during summer. And the summer bookings were really being impacted by rate. Now we see during the course of this winter, snow has been fickle, it's come and gone, there's pockets of it. Sometimes it's really good. This weekend there'll be some great Colorado storms happening. The Northeast is better than last year, but it's, again, those things, they need time to manifest themselves in the overall data. And so we see some softer bookings, some lower rates, and that's pushing RevPAR down. So that's really sort of the big tale of 23, or story of 23, is this rate reset. But kind of secondary to that is taking a look at this slide down the bottom. And what we've done here is we've taken a look at transactions that are going through different channels. And so if we compare what's happening on the rent by owner marketplace, or the short-term rental marketplace, otherwise known as Airbnb and Vrbo, and we compare what's happening with ADRs there versus what's happening through professionally managed sales, or what the property managers are booking, we index those things together, and we actually see a pretty interesting trend. The chart on the bottom is really looking at Q3 of 2022 through to Q3 of 2024 or 2023. So, into Q3 of last year. And what we're doing is indexing ADR in this orange line at STR booked properties, or RVO booked properties, versus professionally managed. And the number that you see on the left is an index number. And anything above 100 is parity. So in other words, if we had this orange line down here at the 100 on the chart, we would know that the short-term rental marketplace is selling things for the same rate as professionally managed marketplace. But in fact, it's about 140. And so it's not really a percentile, but it's about 40% more expensive to book something through the rent by owner marketplaces. And that number has actually continued to go up over the course of those 4 quarters that we're studying here into Q3 of last year. And that sort of corresponds with some of the softening that we're seeing up above in the professionally managed, which sort of indicates that the rent by owner marketplace isn't responding the same way. It's either increasing or holding its rates, and able to do so, even as the professionally managed marketplace is actually having to drop its rates. And there are different things that we can think about why that might be. It might have to do with the fact that a lot of homeowners aren't doing revenue management, right? They're really just trying to capture what rate they can. And so that might be part of it, but it also might be the product or how consumers view it, how they view the value proposition. We haven't dug into that. That's very qualitative and be interesting to look at. And then secondarily, just to provide some context for what happened with rate over the course of these 4 quarters, it is this occupancy, where occupancy has been close to parity between what's being booked on the rent by owner marketplaces and what's being booked professionally, gone up a little bit, in fact. So even as relative rate between the two marketplaces is increasing pretty sharply, relative occupancy is actually increasing a bit too. And that also comes down to a question of, is it because there are more bookings happening in the rent by owner marketplace, or is it because we are actually seeing a pullback on volume professionally managed as a result of some of those economic pressures on consumers or the snow issues that are plaguing some pretty significant parts of the country. So 2023, really a story about rate and reaction, a couple of different marketplaces and what's going on there. I think there are some questions about the short-term rental marketplace that we've got on the Trello board that we can talk about during discussion. So next up is a look ahead, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things that we expect to see over the course of 2024. I'm going to turn my attention to a screen that's over here for a second. At the ADR gains that we talked about, or that I just talked about, are actually probably going to continue. I would expect that rate is probably going to settle right around relatively close to flat. And economic pressure is going to linger for some time. We don't know which way the Federal Reserve is going to go with interest rates, and that does impact people's ability to spend on credit, as well as their mood. The relativity of the rates to last year, but not just last year, but long term, and the fact that things are still, even with year-over-year rates being flat, dramatically higher than they were 4 or 5 years ago. Is part of it, and of course snow comes into play as well. And even though snow really is only in play through March, April, it has a huge impact on how rates behave overall when you aggregate the year. So that's why we think in aggregate it's probably going to be sitting pretty close to flat. Length of stay has stabilized, though, and that's actually really good news. And it's one of the points that we're looking at, because length of stay has actually been shortening for much of the last 36 months or so. But right now, 2024 LOS is looking pretty flat to 2023, so that's great. We're not losing. It's still way down from 2019 by a good night and a half or so, and that can, that's 10% of a 10-night stay. But that is good to see that changing. And as rates come down and settle and consumers get used to that new marketplace, I think we'll probably start to see LOS expand and grow. Part of the reasons for its contraction has been the fact that people still want to travel, but they can't afford the 6 nights or the 5 nights, so they're doing 3 or 4. And so as it becomes more affordable, either in their mind or in reality, they're going to be more comfortable booking longer stays. And room demand and revenue, there's going to be a struggle. Poor Q1 is going to have if Q1 continues the way it is as far as snow goes and making it unsettled, it's going to have an impact on revenue throughout the year. And so RevPAR is going to struggle a little bit. So on the bottom of the screen, what we've got here is an index going back to January 2020 of occupancy in the dark gray right through to here in January of 2024. And then we've got ADR in the green and RevPAR in the red. And this is sort of a projection cone that we've got going outwards. And we have to give a pretty good range on it, because it's so highly impacted by things like snow, like wildfire, and things that aren't necessarily a real driver in urban markets where you could make perhaps better predictions. But we do expect that that's sort of the cone of action where things are going to land over the course of time. And in the meantime, other than occupancy, which is sitting fairly flat to pre-pandemic, which is where we are here at the beginning of the slide, rate and revenue are still dramatically higher, sitting at 60 and 70% higher than they were just 4 years ago. And so there's short-term context and there's long-term context that we keep in mind. And so with that, if no questions, I think I'll hand it back over to Barb to take over the helm and invite others to turn on the camera, and we'll start answering some questions.
I don't think I've ever seen so many questions and or comments come in. It's
Good.
you all can do webinars on some of these topic buckets that they're pretty amazing questions. So I'm going to have Pete and Jan and Tom take a look at those, and I'm just going to throw out an observation, which is perception versus reality. And a lot of the comments and or questions that are coming in are specific to the short-term rental market and the impact that it's having on lodging rates, ADR, RevPAR, the whole thing. What I'm hearing you say, Tom, is that in reality, it's less of an impact. Am I drinking the Kool-Aid, or give
So
a little more insight on that?
I actually had a construction truck outside the window make a noise just when you were saying what it was having an impact. So what
Okay,
is it?
we'll start over again. Well, what I'm saying is that the reality of the impact of short-term rental is having on the destinations is less than we all think it might be when we're trying to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, there are some interesting things around short-term rentals that we've been looking into recently, working with our friends at RRC, and we do studies as well. And you know, there is some perception and some reality disconnect. The actual number of listings in destinations is considerably higher than it used to be, but that's not necessarily all new units, and people need to be careful about that. When we do these studies and clean things up, and we differentiate between pre-existing units and we dedupe all the listings and so forth, there has been growth in inventory, but it hasn't been these staggering 20 and 30 and 40% growth rates that people believe there is because of what shows up on the sites. Careful analysis shows that some destinations actually have fewer units for sale in the short-term rental marketplace. Others have more, and it really does flip around. And you know, you'd find on average it's probably about 10 or 12% more overall since 2018. This isn't since 2022 or 2021. The other side of that is that the Vrbo and Airbnb have largely become OTAs, and the professionally managed inventory is turning up there. And so just looking at listings there really requires careful consideration and understanding of the inventory so you can dedupe those things and understand the difference between a condo property that's listing on Airbnb and a private unit that an owner has listed on Airbnb. It makes a big difference.
Yeah. So I agree, Tom, and I think the days of the one-off, single homeowner having a lot of success listing on Airbnb and Vrbo is probably in the past, because the sophistication that property managers now have, not only, you mentioned it, Tom, revenue management, rate management, they have access to much more sophisticated tools. The one-off renter is not able to compete. The other comment that I'll start to make, and then I'll hand it over to Jan because he can do much more justice to this. It was really astonishing if we look at what happened to Airbnb when they're when the litigation kind of removed them from New York City. The impact on hotels was really quite staggering. So Jan, I'll kind of hand it over to you, and you can kind of share some of that.
Yeah, from a hotel perspective, it's hard to bet against New York these days. There are three forces that are sort of pushing the hotel performance. On the one side, we have 16,000 rooms that were taken out of inventory to house the unhoused and migrants. Number two, the pipeline, while right now pretty strong, because of the new laws and rules and regulations that the union are going to put in place, it's going to be super hard and very expensive to build in New York City. So once the current supply comes online, after that, the final planning and planning stages is de minimis. And thirdly, as you said, I saw the stat from AirDNA that the share of rooms listing for more than 30 days to less than 30 days, is completely, used to be 50-50, and now it's basically 95% more than 30 days. Now anecdotally also the Airbnb inventory in New Jersey has spiked. But I think Manhattan is going to see positive ADR growth for a variety of reasons, group coming back, leisure coming back, transient coming back, but also the lack of Airbnb, I think, is going to be a supporting force for ADRs in that market. And so we're pretty bullish on the market looking ahead.
Jan, who are those 30? Do you know, was there any indication in the data that you saw of who those 30-day stayers in the Airbnb units in Manhattan were? Were they business travelers or long?
Oh, sorry, this is just supply. Like what supply?
I'm sorry. Oh, pardon me.
Because obviously the rule is if you want to be less than 30 days, you can't have anything locked off and you have to live there, which is, I mean, I guess how Airbnb started, but that's not what people want.
Yeah.
And that's not what owners want, quite frankly.
There's another question in here. Last year, we talked quite a bit about soft landing, possible recession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's one in here that is, how long do you anticipate rates to continue to be this strong? And do you see it going into the summer?
So, yeah,
I have a
why don't you
perspective
go, because we see different things.
Yeah, so I've stood on a mountaintop in the rain for a year yelling for a recession because that was the Oxford economics forecast, and I'm a good foot soldier, and I'm saying, so here, therefore, we will have a recession. Never happened. I was wrong for a whole year. So the good news is we're not saying recession anymore. And even the soft landing part, I think it's going to be just like Goldilocks. Looks like everything is, is good. Inflation coming down, consumer sentiment slowly creeping up, but consumer spending forecast to be healthy, GDP growth to be healthy, unemployment rate to be arguably full employment, if you want to use that term. So all of that is good news. How long can room rates on the hotel side continue to go up? My very simple answer is you show me CPI, I show you ADR, right? As long as consumer price index goes up, we as an industry have always been good at driving rate up as well. This year in the hotel industry, we're proposing room rate growth of 3%, and the tourism economic CPI outlook is for 2.1. So we think that there's real pricing power to be had this year. Not a whole lot, but better than nothing. But that's how we look at the hotel side of the equation.
In the mountain destination side, I've actually been standing in the rain on a hilltop saying that rates have gotten too high, too fast for too long. And I don't know if their flattening has proven some version of me being right, or if it's just dumb luck that I got there. But the spike that we saw in the spring of 2021 as vaccines became widely spread was really dramatic, and we saw rates suddenly move up 25 and 30% year over year, and then multiply upon that the following year by another 8 or 9%. And we are now seeing actually some of that drawdown to near flat in response to pullback from consumers. And I think that mountain resorts have actually elevated themselves to a whole different level of consumerism as far as where their consumers are on the economic spectrum, just in the course of the last 36 months. And I think that works for some destinations, and I actually think that opens opportunities for other destinations that might not be set to be elite priced. And so, it's a win and win potentially. But it also, I think, narrows the market that's available to you for consumers and changes maybe what the competitive product looks like.
What about booking windows? Anybody want to be brave on that one? Couple of questions on that.
Our booking lead times actually have returned pretty much to normal. During the pandemic, they extended way out as people just kept punting. There were 140, 150 days for leisure travel. When reopening happened, they compressed down to about 30 days, 28 days, as people were saying, looking over their shoulder and going, it's safe, I can book, right? And now they've really extended back out, and we're seeing seasonal normalcy as far as that goes. During the summer, it's about 48 days, and during the winter, it's about 62, 63 days.
Yeah,
Okay.
a couple of things, Barb, that I'll inject here. I think there's two things on the horizon. One thing I actually mentioned last year, and Jan, I'll give Jan the win on this one. I mentioned Chinese travelers potentially having a big impact on 2023, and Jan said, "Hold on a second, it's going to be 2024." So I think 2024. And there's still a lot of challenges. There's air capacity challenges, there's visa challenges, but I think we'll gradually start seeing the impact of Asian travelers. And when we talk about Asian travelers, we talk about Chinese travelers that really drive that market. So I think we'll start to see that as maybe a tailwind that will help us continue this momentum that we've had. There's also something that occurs every 4 years in November that I think everybody is looking at as a potential headwind to the industry, and that's obviously the election. So that's something that we'll all just have to keep our eyes on and see how that impacts things. I think we could shoot a dart and say here's how it's going to impact, but there's always a little bit of unease during election years. This year, I don't know why, there seems to be just as much, if not more, unease. So we'll keep our eyes on it. But in general, and we see this as we look at, the big publicly traded online travel companies are still just reporting absolute record earnings. They're all streamlining their businesses, replatforming, and continuing to just really excel. Tech companies in general are still, I'd say, right-sizing their employee base. So we see layoffs from some of the big platform companies. But that just makes them more profitable is what it's doing. It's allowing them to kind of, navigate a high interest rate environment and maintain the kind of the cash printing cows that they all are. So, like Jan said, full employment, it looks to be like we will be in that state of full employment for at least the foreseeable future. So it's just a fascinating time to see, all of these factors play out against each other. But really the travel industry at large has done exceptionally well over the last year, and we anticipate that it will continue to be a pretty solid ride here for the, at least for the near term.
Well, and you bring up a couple of interesting points there in looking at the whole picture, Pete. We've got some pretty amazing questions and or comments coming in. I hesitate to ask a couple of them because I think they're a more lengthy answer than we have time for. There's one, however, it's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, but it talks about the impact of rising ADR, lower occupancy overall in the mountain destinations, and the impact that might have on the other businesses in the community. Restaurants, retail, whatever that might be. And again, a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, but do any of you have thoughts on that?
Well, I bet there's also an urban answer that Jan's got, but in the mountains, what I'll say is that we've seen that rising ADRs have put pressure on consumers, and for the most part, we've watched sales tax receipts suffer, so that the retail fronts are actually finding themselves a little bit harder to make their mark, mostly because people are investing in the cost of getting to and then staying in the destination and whatever the preferred activity is while they're there. Now, if it happens to be spending time on Main Street and shopping, then that's great. But there's less disposable income available, and of course, higher rates that are driving fewer bookings also means fewer people just on Main Street, at least overnight stays. But anybody who's been to a mountain town in the last year and a half will tell you that Main Street's pretty busy, and day visitors are showing up and they're doing their thing. But certainly ADR and occupancy and the way they perform lately do have an impact on Main Street's ability to make its nut. And Jan, I don't know if that's the same in the urban centers.
Yeah, maybe there's a slightly different way to and talk about bifurcation, right? Because the higher the ADR, then suddenly they're sort of price insensitive and it doesn't matter. And they spend $1,000 a night on the room, plus then they're going to go out and have all the auxiliary services, versus you used to spend 150, now you have to spend 250, and now you're saying, okay, maybe I'm trading down. So I think for the 0.1 percenters, as somebody called it, the basis point in a presentation, I thought that was a nice visual. So the very, very small amount of people who can afford it, for them, I think the spending continues, just I think on the other income levels.
Yeah, good point.
There's another question in here. I actually am going to refer to you, Tom, because I know that there's work being done in this arena, but it's talking about for the residents of the resort communities, how life is pretty challenging these days, whether it's from availability of services, housing, whatever it might be. Tom, I'm going to have you speak to that because I know that there's work being done in this arena. And then I'm going to come back to all of you for your thoughts on where should our attendees focus their attention in 2024?
Sure.
Where are their opportunities?
I'll be really quick given the time.
Yes.
There has been a big change in tourism destinations and how residents feel about lifestyle, quality of life, the ability to stay there. And it really comes down to a conversation about resident centricity versus tourism centricity. And really, what is the focus of the governing entity and how do you maintain that balance? You're right, Barb, we are doing work with the Insights Collective on community equilibrium and measuring, sort of where residents see the community going, where elected officials see the community going, and how they're going to get there, and actually finding a way to measure that and make sure that you can maintain the lifestyle that mountain residents have come to expect from living in a resort town without sacrificing the tourism economy, which is the bread and butter. And I'll stop it there because it is a very long answer to go into it any further. But I think one of the other two guys, or you, Barb, may have something to add.
Absolutely correct. So where would you focus your attention if you were one of the attendees through the remainder of 24? I say the remainder of 24 and we're in February, but sometimes it seems like we're already planning for 25.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly and say that, understanding rate and maybe sacrificing rate to capture some more visitors with the right mix that gets you RevPAR positive is the way to go. I think we're clutching on to positive rate to no end and maybe to negative effect. So that would be my own takeaway.
Yeah, and I'll build off of that. That I think loyalty is one of those terms that we've done a lot of work around, and properties have a lot of tools at their disposal to drive loyal business. And to Tom's point, if you can sacrifice a little bit of rate to drive more travelers and then keep them and convert them next time, directly, that's going to pay off. The other thing that I'll add is ChatGPT and Gen AI, it's overwhelming for many, but you've got to start experimenting with it if you're not already. Certainly from a customer service perspective, it can really make you a lot more efficient in responding to emails, or just using it to just make your operations more efficient. If you don't have to worry about the whole agent thing and like, how do I integrate Gen AI into my booking tool? Providers will start to do that for you, but just really start experimenting with it on an operational perspective, because it's not going to go away. And if you're not kind of learning how to use it now, you're going to get arguably left a little bit behind.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Tom is right. The top line matters, but the conversations I have with owners, they're all like, "Yep, we have no problem with your 4% RevPAR growth, Jan, but let's talk about the middle of the P&L." Higher insurance costs, how do we manage labor costs, what happens with energy costs given what's going on in the Middle East, like all of those topics about how you manage expenses is very, very much top of mind. Number two, to Pete's point, I'm a big fan of a podcast called Hard Fork. It's a terrible name, but it's the New York Times tech podcast. and all they talk about is AI. It's super interesting. It's only an hour. It's every Friday morning. And these, I don't have time to do, what Pete does for a living, and weed through all the things that are out there. These guys do an excellent job synthesizing. And lastly, selfish plug, we have our own data podcast now called Tell Me More, a hospitality data podcast with our friends from STR. If you're interested in that, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Awesome.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank all three of you and the attendees. Again, your questions and comments we could drill down pretty deeply on some of these, and I'm sure that Tom and Pete and Jan and their organizations will do exactly that as we move forward. I'm going to turn it over to Tom to close out. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. And for those of you who stayed on for our 3 minutes overtime, I really appreciate it. Jan and Pete and Barb, fantastic to have you join us again. Looking forward to the next one. And maybe we'll talk about a few of those questions and get something out to some of our attendees as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.